Hello, class. We are continuing our discussion here about exponential growth. So in our last discussion, we talked about growth, the challenges of population growth, particularly human population growth, in terms of contributing toward environmental problems. And in a similar vein, we're going to focus today on the challenge of exponential growth in consumption. And resource use. And so when you look at sort of these big grand challenges to environmental problems that help explain why we have environmental problems today, we talked, first of all, we started talking about distancing, how we're removed from the environmental impacts around us because of globalization, because of urbanization, because of the ways that we have shaped our lives in modern society. We are very removed from the ways that our decisions impact the world around us. And then we talked about exponential growth, and population is a part of that, and consumption is a part of that. And so we're going to talk, label this kind of 2B. I think the last lecture and this one sort of go together in helping explain why environmental impacts have increased very significantly. First, it's worth saying at the beginning that economic growth has been really beneficial for human society. Maybe this is a duh moment, an obvious thing to say, but economic growth has benefited human society in tremendous ways. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just very briefly, economic growth has helped bring tremendous amounts of people out of extreme poverty around the world. This chart right here just looks at since 1990, so not very long ago. And looks at the reductions in extreme poverty has more than halved since has been cut in more than half. So from almost 2 billion people down to about 700 million people living in extreme poverty in only about 2.5 decades here. So very significant reductions in poverty. And of course, GDP, gross domestic product, a measure of economic activity, has increased very dramatically in the past decades, in the past couple of centuries. So we simply, and notice that this is adjusted for $2005. This isn't actual dollars here. It's already adjusted, but our income, we have a lot more money, and that has led to a lot more benefits that we have been able to enjoy and to benefit from in human society. But that leads to this question of what do you do when you have more money? Well, the answer, of course, is we buy more stuff, right? There's a quote from historian Gary Cross here. It says, the dominant ideology holding America together today is consumerism. So more so, he says, even more so than our political ideology or our adherence to capitalism or to democracy. It's consumerism that most defines who we are and how we make decisions. This idea that it's our right to purchase goods and that our social identity comes from those goods is the defining characteristic of our society today. And I think there's probably some element of truth to that, that helps sort of explain the nature of the society that we live in today. Of course, this is a challenge when you're talking about the ways that human society impacts the natural environment. Because if you remember back to our IPAT equation, I being impact, environmental impact, as a product of population, we talked about that a lot in our last lecture, times affluence times technology. So affluence is defined as the amount of consumption per person. In other words, the more affluent we are, the wealthier we are, the more we consume. Which makes obvious sense, right? When you have more money, you buy more stuff. When you have less money, you buy less stuff. And historically, we buy a lot of stuff today because we are much wealthier than previous generations have been before. And it's not that stuff necessarily is bad in and of itself, but stuff comes with a lot of environmental impacts. Just like with human population is of course not bad in any way. Right? It's inherently good. We're told biblically that we're made in the image of God and that all people are good. So that's not bad at all. But it's important to note that exponential increases in human population growth have led to significant environmental challenges. And it's the same thing with affluence and with stuff and with consumption. That significant increases in the amount of stuff that we are buying and producing and making and disposing of is leading to significant problems as well. And that's important to recognize. So pause the video here. I want you to pick one of these three products here and list a few of the ways that it impacts the environment. Just think of, whatever you can think of related to what are some potential ways that one of these products could impact the environment around it. So go ahead and pause and make that list. Okay, obviously, all products have environmental impacts associated with them, right? Whether it's producing a car, which is a large item that has a lot of impacts to it, from the mining of the metals produced in that to the energy required to put the car together and to deliver it to you, to all of the gasoline you burn to drive that car, if that's an internal combustion engine car, around, to what happens when you're disposing of that car. Is it recycled? And if not, what kinds of environmental impacts? What kinds of fluid leaks is this going to have? There's a lot of different ways that car impacts the environment. Same thing for a bottle of Coke or even a ream of paper. You can think about the different ways that these products impact the environment, from the extraction of the natural resources that goes into making them, to the energy that is consumed in using some of these, or the air and water pollution that is used in order to produce them, to the disposal, end-of-life disposal. What kinds of environmental impacts does the end-of-life disposal have for this product? There are all kinds of different ways that products that we use today impact the environment. And it tends to be the larger, more complex the item, the bigger the impact that it does tend to have. The point being here, and this is obvious and intuitive in many senses, but each item that we have, that we consume, that when we engage in a consumer culture and purchase an item, that item has an impact on the environment. Now, that single item obviously is a small impact, but accumulated with 8 billion people consuming these items, and particularly in the United States, where we consume a lot of stuff, that stuff has ever increasing amounts of impacts as we consume more and more of it. So that's important for us to understand within this context of explaining why environmental challenges exist today and how human society contributes to that. Here's a really fascinating chart that I found that breaks down where the average household income, this is from an American perspective, so where does the average household income go? And you can see some really interesting breakdowns here in terms of where our percentage of spending tends to go. The biggest one being for our housing, about 20% for housing itself, and then another 7% or so for various utilities, and then other household furnishings. So a pretty big chunk, about a third of it all together, to our homes. In the US, we tend to spend quite a lot on transportation, particularly compared to other countries. So you see pretty large amounts here. The only one chunk of it is for actually vehicle purchases. Quite a large amount goes to gas and to other transportation related expenses as well. So pretty lot there. Food is actually a very small percentage in the United States. In fact, I don't have this chart up here, but if you look at and compare percentage of household income spent on food with other countries, the US has by far the lowest percentage of our income spent on food of any country in the world. Well, I shouldn't say, I haven't looked at all 195, but when you compare similar countries, the percent that we spend on food is extremely low. Most countries are much higher than that. Even other developed countries, like European countries, tend to be closer to 10 or 12%, whereas we're 7% food at home. This shocks me that the average American household spends almost as much eating out as they do eating at home. Who are these people who can afford to eat out that much? I mean, that sounds delightful and easy and really unhealthy, but also quite expensive. Quite a lot on insurance that we spend, and quite a lot on healthcare. Our healthcare costs are quite a lot more than most other countries tend to be as well. So very interesting looking at where our spending goes and noting that not all types of expenditure have equal environmental impacts as well. Some have more impacts certainly than others. So for example, if a lot of your transportation is done by driving around as opposed to using public transportation, then that's a very different kind of environmental impact. Or the choices we make within categories has a significant difference, like where we purchase our food from, for example. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be broken down differently to change how our impact on the environment looks like. So question number 2, what are some ways that you could shift your spending to decrease your environmental impact? Just looking at this chart, what are ways that you could move from here to there that would result in decreasing impact? All right, moving on from there. Also interesting to note, and you saw this in your reading, but one of the things that we have seen is that increasing income doesn't necessarily bring increasing happiness. In fact, what we find, and this chart right here looks at, on the x-axis, you see GDP per capita. In other words, the further to the right, the wealthier the society is. And on the Y scale here, life satisfaction. This is self-reported life satisfaction here. And you see, obviously, at lower income levels, money really brings a lot more satisfaction in life. And that's obvious. If you're in extreme poverty, then getting a little bit more money really makes a big difference in your satisfaction with life. But that really changes after around $20,000 to $30,000. If you look, around here, around $30,000, there's not much change at all after this point. In fact, pretty much every country is somewhere between 6 and 7.5 or so on this scale, as opposed to, prior to that, it goes down as low as 3. But there's not much change once you go above $30,000, and certainly above about $40,000 or so, there's very little change. In fact, look at, compare Singapore here, extremely wealthy country, is relatively equally as happy or satisfied with life as Romania is, or almost as much as Brazil, even though those have far lower income categories. Or Luxembourg, which is about twice as wealthy as the United States, is about the same level of satisfaction as Israel, which is a far lower GDP. So you see this interesting dynamic where, yes, increasing economic growth really brings a lot of satisfaction and happiness and well-being to a certain point, but that certain point is actually quite a lot lower than the average income of what we enjoy in the United States. And that there's really not a clear connection between those as we go up further, which is simply to point to the maybe economic growth isn't quite all that it's cracked up to be in our minds. We see the same thing, life expectancy. Big changes in life expectancy as you go from extreme poverty to a little bit more sort of emerging middle income countries, but same thing, around $30,000 or so dollars in terms of GDP per capita, again, which is well below the average in the United States. You don't really see much impact on life expectancy once you get up higher than that. You have some variation here or there. The United States is actually quite a bit, a little bit lower than almost all other developed countries here, which is really interesting. That's a whole other topic we could talk about, but not a lot of continued increase as you go up. In contrast, we do see significant correlations between income inequality and health and social problems that societies face. That the more unequal a society is, the more problems, health problems and social problems that society faces. And this is just a list of what's included in those index of health and social problems as well. All of these things go up as you have more unequal. So the United States, which is one of the most unequal societies in the world, it probably is the most unequal of all higher income societies, has very significant amounts of all of these problems compared to other countries as well. And the more equal societies, Scandinavian societies, Japan, for example, tend to have very low levels of these health and social problems. So that income inequality, rather than overall income, is really a better measure of societal well-being. In contrast, we do see significant correlations between increasing income and increasing carbon emissions. So this is just one measure of environmental impact, CO2 emissions per capita. And we see, as you would expect, and we'll talk more about this particular metric later, but as you would expect, as incomes go up, carbon emissions go up, and they continue to go up. So there's not, unlike some of those other graphs where it's like, well, above a certain amount, they're kind of all the same. There is variation, pretty big variation here, but we do see that the higher you go up, the higher that they tend to be. Though it is worth noting that, many countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, very similar levels of well-being, and yet the UK has a much lower carbon footprint on average than the United States. So there is a lot of variation that happens there. So if money doesn't bring happiness, why? Why is that the case? Why doesn't money bring happiness? That's a good question. And your book points to a few different explanations for this, one being the positional nature of consumer goods. In other words, goods bring happiness, but only relative to whether others have them or not. So many consumer goods, other than, beyond the basic necessities of life, consumer goods bring us satisfaction and happiness relative to whether others have them. Once everyone has them, they no longer bring any additional satisfaction from having them. In fact, they can bring dissatisfaction because we look to others who have newer and better stuff related to that. So there's a positional or a relative aspect of whether the role that consumer goods play in terms of our overall happiness. Diminishing marginal utility of stuff. In other words, the more you have of something, the less enjoyment you get from having an additional unit of that thing. Think of it in terms of what's the best bite of ice cream? It's always the first one, right? The first one is the best bite. The 50th bite of ice cream starts to get pretty boring, right? So this diminishing marginal utility. So it's the pleasure you get from having one of something. As you go up, that pleasure reduces. It doesn't bring a whole lot more pleasure from having that. And happiness is closely related to income in countries with less income inequality. So happiness is higher in countries that are more equal. It brings us to this idea of the growth imperative. So your book talks about this, why do you think that's the case? I don't think I have this as a question for you to reflect on, but why is it the case that growth is an imperative in our culture? Well, I think there's a few explanations for this, but the system doesn't allow for anything else. We have crafted our economic and socio-political system around assuming growth, right? In order to pay off debt. How would the United States pay off our national debt without growing the economy? We couldn't. It's not possible. Or our individual debt. We need to continue to grow economically in order to pay off the debt that we have. Companies have to maximize their profits. Profit maximization is core to how companies operate. If you don't grow, you're going to go out of business, is the mantra in the business world. And we see that over and over again. Companies that don't grow and get bigger do go out of business over and over and over again. So this growth imperative, if you can't grow your business, then you're not going to stay in business. If we can't grow our economy, then our economy is going to be ruined. This is sort of a necessity. And it's a cultural mandate as well that's just assumed. I mean, think about it. What politician gets up there and say, I'm in favor of holding the economy steady. We're not going to grow the economy. We're just going to stay content with where it's at. No, they would never get voted into office. Because it's just so ingrained in our psyche, in our culture, that economic growth is a must. It's an imperative, that it's sort of a de facto understanding of how life should be. So reflect on this question. Why is endless growth problematic? What do you think? Well, let's think about it this way. What kinds of things exhibit endless growth? We don't really see this a lot in the world. It tends to be things like viruses or tumors or things that are bad. Endless growth that doesn't end, that just keeps going. These are things that are bad for society. Infinite growth needs infinite resources. We can't have endless growth forever. Think about some of the challenges the world is facing. We talked a little bit about those a couple lectures ago, and we'll get into them more in the next lecture. but think about some of the challenges, the environmental challenges the world is facing. Endless growth assumes that we're going to continue to grow our economy, which means continuing to rely upon natural resources, not just rely upon natural resources, but to increase our reliance on natural resources, to increase the number of resources that we're using and tapping into. The world's already stretched to the breaking point in terms of environmental problems, but economic growth, endless economic growth, necessitates an endless stream of natural resources, which we simply don't have. We don't have endless resources. So endless growth is only endless for a while until the system crashes because you run out of resources to supply that system with. It's simply not possible. It's not feasible within the laws of physics or the constraints of the planet that we live upon to have endless growth indefinitely into the future. So this idea that we have crafted into our economic and political system, that endless growth is a desire, not even a desire, but an imperative of society, is based upon a premise that just can't work in real life. So that's problematic. Your book talks about this idea of a treadmill of production, this idea. And I like this little political cartoon here. So I think it visualizes that idea kind of well, but it's this idea that that this production just begets more production, that we depend on production to solve the world's problems. How do we solve poverty? Well, by growing the economy. How do we solve environmental problems? By creating new products to address them. How do we solve unemployment? By growing the economy. And you see this reflecting, what are the workers doing? They're running the treadmill in order to chase more profits. And in the process, they're creating more stuff and more pollution. And some of them are getting hurt along the way. And this idea that we just continue to pursue more and more and more, and it's always out of reach. I really like that visualized here, that it's always out of reach, because that really is how our economy has grown, right? No one starts to ask this question of, when is enough enough? When can we be content with where our economy has gotten to? No one, you would never get anywhere in our society with that question. And yet, that question is an important one to be asking, because we can't forever grow our economies. Okay, moving on from that. And we also see that inequality income inequality is a significant issue. This is really fascinating. I found this data on our World in Data. I use a lot of slides from our World in Data. You probably noticed already. Great data resource. In some countries, inequality is not a huge issue. A lot of the European countries, in Japan, for example, yes, there's inequality, but a lot less than there used to be. And it's not nearly as high. But a lot of the English-speaking countries, on the other hand, we see there used to be a lot of inequality. That went down, and now it's gone way up again. So like in the United States, for example, income inequality is as high now as it was during the Gilded Age, when the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the Vanderbilts owned all the wealth in the country. And that's exactly what we see now. So this economic growth doesn't always pan out in terms of benefiting everybody. What we have seen lately, particularly in the US, but in other places too, is that a lot of that growth simply goes towards making the rich richer, and the rest of us just kind of stay where we are. So it doesn't always result in very helpful outcomes. All right, question number 4. What happens if we refrain from consumption? So this idea of frugality. Well, maybe we just don't consume as much. Maybe this is sort of talked about as a virtue, right? So reflect on that. What are the repercussions if we simply refrain from consumption, consume less? Right, this is problematic, because if we refrain from consumption, what happens to the economy? The economy goes down, because because more people are buying less stuff. And if we're buying less stuff, then we're hurting the economy. So consumption is of fundamental importance to the US economy, and abstaining from consumption or practicing frugality hurts the economy, even though frugality traditionally is seen as a virtue. And we hear this, you talk about with money managers, with people who will advise you, how should you use your money wisely? Well, be frugal with your spending. Don't overspend. Don't buy what you don't need. And yet our society says the exact opposite. Buy what you don't need. Borrow from that. Use your credit card. Continue to purchase stuff. We have new and better stuff. And that consumerism mentality is leading to significant problems because of the, going back to what we started off talking about, how every product produced has an environmental impact. So the more products we buy, the more impact there is, even though logic, common sense, our spiritual values point us toward refraining from consumerism. Consumerism, you've probably heard it in church talked about as a false god, of pursuing money, pursuing wealth, pursuing consumption, keeping up with the Joneses, living a lifestyle that exceeds yourself. These are all negative things, and yet this is what our society pushes us toward because it is good for our economy, because it grows our economy. And yet maybe it kills our soul in the process. And certainly it is significantly degrading the viability of the planet that we live on. So look, reflect on this. We'll talk about some of these later on today, but what solutions can you think of to this dilemma? Pause the video, give some reflections on that. We'll talk about some solutions later today. We'll get into even more later on in this course. But I want to talk first about the sociological drivers of consumption. In other words, what are the things that are pushing us towards increasing our consumption, towards continuing to consume? First one, this idea of conspicuous consumption. In other words, we consume to display social power and status. Keeping up with the Joneses is a good way of thinking of this one. In fact, there's a really interesting movie. I think there's a couple of them. I'm thinking of the one from a little while ago, from the 2000s, called The Joneses. I think it's rated R. I looked it up recently. I've been recommending it because I'm so fascinated by it. I think there's some sketchy stuff in it. But it's a really interesting look at the way society pushes us to do that. Another phrase that's often used along with conspicuous consumption is rising benchmark. In other words, the benchmark for what is socially acceptable keeps rising. And so we need to keep up with that. We're trying to display our status by continuing to meet that benchmark that gets higher and higher. This is the car you should drive. These are the clothes that you should wear. These are things that push us toward that. Creation of self-identity, this idea that a lot of the things we buy, we've created sort of an identity around that. You may have noticed by now, I sort of have a reputation for having an identity of wearing these styled hats. I've probably already worn several different ones for this video. That's sort of my thing that I'm known by on campus. Once I had a hat that was hung on my office door in this style, and it wasn't mine. I put it on. Is this mine? Oh, it doesn't even fit, but somebody left it somewhere else and they assumed it was mine because that's sort of my brand, my identity. Similarly, I'm a big backpacker. I'm big into outdoorsy type stuff. I shop at Backcountry a lot. So like these, you look at Backcountry's website, this is the thing, like these are the things that you should buy in order to be a backcountry outdoorsy kind of guy. You should wear this shirt, these pants, this hydration pack, that bike. These are the kinds of things that define who you are if you're an outdoorsy person. If you're a country guy, you own a truck because that truck defines who you are. It determines when people look at you, within your peer circle, they have certain thoughts or ideas about who you are and your identity is based upon what you drive, what you wear, what kinds of products that you display. So I want you to think about this. I'm hoping this question is achievable for you. I think this makes sense. And I think you can do this. But name one way you consume to express your identity. So for me, I'll just give a few one example there. I have a lot of name brand outdoor gear jackets, for example. I have way too many jackets. Actually, maybe this is a better example for my next slide. But name brand jacket, the North Face, Patagonia, Mountain Hardwear. Maybe these names don't mean that much to you, but for people who are big into outdoor recreation and extreme sports, those names matter. And so I wear them because they're functional and practical for the kinds of things I use them for, but they also express a certain identity. This says, I'm a backpacker type kind of guy, look at me. So in all honesty, if I have to reflect on that, that's a part of the calculus for why I buy those kinds of gear as opposed to others. So pause it and see, come up with one way that you express your identity through consumption. So another one, specialization. Your book talks about this example. I think it's a great one about the different kinds of shoes. In the old days, in our grandparents' time, we only had a couple pairs of shoes, a nice pair of shoes and a work pair of shoes, and that was it. Now we have lots and lots of different pairs of shoes. This one picks on women, which is like the classic stereotype, but same thing for men. If I look at my closet, I have a lot of different kinds of shoes as well. I have shoes that I wear to work. I have shoes that I wear just around to wherever else, the store. I have a pair of sandals. I have a pair of running shoes because I need them for running. I have a pair of hiking boots. I have a pair of mountaineering boots, which is totally different need from hiking boots. I have a grungy pair of shoes that I wear if I'm going to muck out the chicken coop. I think I've got a few others as well, right? So we have very specialized types of uses for these, and I can justify in my mind easily enough why I need all those different kinds of shoes. I can't wear my work shoes running, for example. I'm not going to wear my sandals to muck out the chicken coop. But that kind of specialization drives us to purchase more. Same thing, going back to my jacket analogy. My wife gives me a hard time because I have so many jackets, so many winter jackets. I'm really into things like mountaineering and climbing and backpacking. These jackets I layer them differently depending on the conditions and the temperature and precipitation levels and et cetera, and being able to layer them together to make multiple levels of warmth, et cetera. I can justify easily enough why I have so many jackets, but that just drives more consumption. Owning all of those jackets or those shoes or those whatever leads towards increased consumption in society. Another driver, structural pressures. Your book calls these socio-technical systems. That I read that and I'm like, the heck are you talking about? Doesn't make any sense. I like to think of it as structural pressures. Maybe that's not any clearer to you, but it makes sense to me. Think of it this way. In our society, we tend to do shopping at places like this, right? Big box stores, malls, places that have really large parking lots. And we don't tend to live by these places, nor do these places have public transportation usually that goes to them. So we have to own a car. If you live in our society, and unless you live in a dense urban center, like New York or Boston or Chicago, you have to own a car. You just can't get by without it. That's a structural pressure. So we have to consume a vehicle. We have to own a vehicle in order to even shop for basic things like clothing or groceries in our society. We just don't have an option to do that another way. Again, unless you live in a few handful of urban areas. Or how about think of professional dress? If you work in a professional work environment, you need to dress in business professional outfit, right? So you probably don't own this as a college student, a suit and a tie or a business professional outfit. These are the kinds of things that you don't tend to own until you need to own it. Well, that's something, a structural pressure, something in society that is forcing you to purchase something that you wouldn't otherwise perhaps have gotten. Other examples related to this, structural pressures. So we own an electric car. I'm not sure, I don't remember if I mentioned that or not. I reference that a lot because I find it to be a useful reference point, but my wife drives that. I end up driving the minivan. Well, as environmentally conscious as I am, a minivan is the only choice right now for a family of 5. Our extended family is a long ways away, so if we're going to visit them, we can all fit in the electric Bolt for trips around town, maybe even up to Buffalo. But if we're driving down to Georgia to visit my family, we can't take all of us and our stuff in the Chevy Bolt. So we've got to drive the minivan. And that's because society does not yet have energy efficient or low carbon options for transporting a family of 5, that kind of distance. It just doesn't exist. Likewise, there's no public infrastructure where I live. So that's not an option for me to use. Or disposables for school lunches. My daughter today is on a field trip where the school said you have to bring a disposable lunch. Well, I was so aggravated by this. I was complaining to her about it. She says, "Not my fault, Dad. It's like, why do I have to send disposable lunch? Why can't I, like I usually do, send it in a packaged container that she brings home and that we wash and use again? Well, it's because they don't want to collect all of these things from the 60 or so kids on the field trip. So what am I going to do now? Send my daughter on a field trip because it's using disposables? No, I'm not going to do that. So I have to send something disposable along with that. So various examples. Planned obsolescence. I don't feel like I need to talk a lot about this because we have a good sense for what this is like. Things go out of style or they get upgraded, the newer, the better phone, or they can't be repaired. Have you ever tried repairing an iPhone? I did once, and gosh, it was incredibly difficult and hard to do. So it can't be repaired, just upgrade to a new one, or there's new features that you want to get to. So planned obsolescence, another driver. This one was not mentioned in the book, but I wanted to include it here. It's called the Diderot effect. And the idea is that you buy something new and nice, and now all of a sudden it doesn't fit with the other stuff. And so you have to upgrade those as well. In other words, we bought this nice new couch, but hey, this new couch looks kind of dingy in our living room next to this rug or next to this lamp. If we're gonna have a nice couch, we should have a nice rug and a nice lamp, etc. So in other words, purchasing something leads to the perceived need to purchase something else as well. So we, a couple of years ago, upgraded to a king size bed. A variety of different reasons why that was the good and right decision to make. But now we need a new bed frame. So we had to purchase a new bed frame related to that. Or let's say you buy a new TV. Now all of a sudden it doesn't fit on the entertainment center that you used to have your TV on. So you need to buy a new one there. So a lot of different things that go into that. So green consumption, is this an opportunity or is this part of the problem? One thing to be cautious of, I will only briefly hit on this. One of my environmental communication class, we talk a lot more about greenwashing. You may have heard of this concept, but greenwashing is essentially, it's when products appear to be environmentally friendly, but really aren't. And you see this probably a lot. Pay attention to a commercial. If you see a commercial that hints at some sort of environmental attribute, pay attention to that and think critically about it. And you'll see some examples here like this Huggies Pure and Natural. Well, there's really nothing pure and natural about a disposable diaper. Maybe it's marginally better, I don't know, because it has organic cotton. That's great. I'm sure that's better than the alternative, but you're still talking about a disposable product that's just going to go into the landfill. So this is not really environmentally friendly. Or clean burning natural gas. Natural gas doesn't burn clean. It emits carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas that traps heat and warms our planet. There's nothing clean burning about it. Cleaner than coal? Yeah. Cleaner than petroleum? Yeah. But clean? No, definitely not clean. Or this Coke one, like, I don't know what's supposed to be environmentally friendly about this. The only thing I really see is this natural sources, whatever the heck that is. But it's in this nice field and you got these green lettering. It just looks really green, right? If you just looked at this without thinking about it, you might think, oh, Coke, this is a green product here, this Coke Life thing. Well, think more critically about that. Oftentimes questions don't really have easy answers either. Like, which is the most sustainable of these options? What do you think? Is it the disposable plastic bag, the paper bag, the reusable plastic bag, the reusable cloth bag? The answer is a little more complex than you might think. Particularly if you look at, like, what does the global warming impact of each of these products look like? Well, to produce a paper bag requires 3 times the carbon emissions of producing a disposable plastic bag. Reusable plastic bag 11 times, and a reusable canvas bag 131 times. In other words, if you have this cloth grocery bag, you have to use that 131 times before you equal the carbon output of producing 1 plastic bag. Now, of course, you've got the waste issue as well. So these disposable plastic bags create all kinds of waste challenges, whereas this paper bag right here doesn't. But it's 3 times worse from a carbon perspective. Which is one of these is the right answer that creates the least amount of waste and the least amount of emissions combined together? Well, it depends upon a number of different variables. It isn't necessarily as straightforward as you might think it would be. Or which of these reams of paper do you think is better for the environment. This one is made from 100% recycled paper. This one's made from 30% recycled paper. I used to always assume the 100%, of course, is better because it's 100% recycled content paper. In one of my courses in grad school, one of my classmates who was in the sustainability department of 3M, which is, they make Post-it notes and all kinds of other office supplies. And she noted that when they created their sustainability criteria for the company 3M, which is a fairly sustainable oriented company, that they set a standard of purchasing 30% recycled paper instead of 100%. And the reason was because if everyone who is sustainability minded all buys 100% recycled paper, right? So, sorry, let me step back. Paper is not infinitely recyclable. Paper can only be recycled a few times, about 2 or 3 times before the fibers break down and can no longer be repurposed into paper again. So 100% recycled paper, that's great, but you can't just continue to make all paper from 100%. We won't ever get to a spot where all the paper in the store is 100% recycled content. So if everyone who cares about it is only buying that, then there's no market for, say, sustainably sourced material. That's what this FSC logo here is about. So their determination was that buying sustainably sourced paper was far more important than the percentage of recycled content. Yes, it should be partially recyclable content, but you can never have it all recyclable content on a full economy-wide scale because it's just not feasible to do that. So the best solution in their mind, their determination, was to prioritize sustainable certification for their paper and make sure it's partial recycled content. And that's what they determined was the best outcome. I think I'm running out of time. Skip what I was going to say about that. Some problems with efficiency. So your book brings this up. And we'll talk about 2 important things, and make sure you pay attention to these because these are concepts that will show up on the test. Rebound effect and the Jevons paradox. So the rebound effect essentially says that increases in efficiency don't result in the same proportional decreases in consumption. Don't proportional reduction. Yes, okay, that's what I said. In other words, if you make a car 20% more efficient, you're not going to get 20% less driving from that. Probably you're going to get 15% less driving. In other words, people are still driving less. Sorry, scratch what I just said. You make a car 20% more efficient, you're not going to get 20% less gas consumed. Because what's going to happen is because that car is more efficient, people are going to drive it farther. And driving it farther means that they will consume more gas. Now, less gas is consumed on a per mile basis, but you're driving more miles. So maybe you reduce your gas usage by 15%, but that 20% reduction in fuel economy or increase in fuel economy didn't result in a 20% decrease in gas, only resulted in a 15% decrease. That's just a hypothetical scenario. Jevons paradox is when that rebound effect is so significant that it completely negates all savings. In other words, increase in efficiency results in consumption increases. So you've made, that would be a case where you've made a car 20% more efficient, but you drive it so much farther that you actually consume more gas than you used to because of that. Another example would be LED light bulbs. LED light bulbs use so little energy that people feel comfortable leaving them on for longer. So people, whereas people used to be, maybe, let's say you were in the habit of turning your light off all the time because you had an old incandescent bulb and your energy bills were really high and you always turn your lights off and you leave the room. Well, now you put LED bulbs in. Oh, shoot, these are so low on energy use. I'm just going to leave it on all the time because it's easier that way. And then all of a sudden you're using more energy than you used to. Now, this is tricky because this doesn't always play out in the same way. There's ongoing debate on whether these energy efficiency changes actually result in more consumption or not. Personally, I have not seen that to be the case. When I switched to a hybrid Prius from a regular car, my driving went up a little bit, about 10%, but my fuel economy doubled. So the doubling of my fuel economy way more than made up for my 10% increase in driving. When I switched to an electric car, my driving didn't go up at all, actually. It stayed about the same. So I didn't see that personally play out. I do have a few lights in my home that I leave on for various reasons. rather than turning off because they're LED, which certainly I wouldn't if they were incandescent, but not very many. So again, I feel like the rebound effect and the Jevons paradox have some validity to them, but it doesn't usually play out to the extent of being a Jevons paradox. Again, the relationship between these, a Jevons paradox is simply a rebound effect that has completely negated all savings. So it goes to the extreme. Here's a visualization of what this could look like. So let's say you got a vehicle that is more fuel efficient. Look at this straight line here first. That fuel efficient results in less energy being burned per mile that you're driving. But because of those lower running costs to drive the car, you drive further or more often, maybe trips that you didn't used to drive, you do now, thus meaning that you're increasing your energy use. Or maybe the savings that you have from your lower gas bills, you end up using to take a trip somewhere, a vacation somewhere, or maybe use it to buy a new phone or buy new something else. So there's an indirect effect as well from the savings that come from that. And the result being that there's more energy embodied in that decision than not. Now, this is not always the case, but sometimes it plays out this way. Sorry, I've been on the slide for a while here, and I feel like our lecture is going long. Okay, I'll try to push through this a little more quickly. Why does this happen? Skip that question. The answer to that is simply lower prices increase demand. It's easier to justify using it. More money increases spending. You're shifting your spending towards something else. I'm going to pause this for a moment here. Okay, my apologies, folks. I know this one's going a little bit longer. I added too many slides in here. Bear with me for a couple more slides, and then I'll breeze through the last ones, and then we'll be done. These are some concepts talked about in your book that are important to reiterate. Energy intensity refers to the amount of energy used to produce a given level of output. You also see carbon intensity, which is simply the amount of carbon used to produce a given level of output. In other words, how much energy does it take to make that widget? This widget right here, how much energy does it take to produce this? The idea being the more energy efficient it is to produce it. So maybe the company that built this phone streamlined their operations. Maybe they put solar panels on the roof. Maybe they found a way to produce them faster so the factories can produce more phones in the same amount of time. Maybe they put in a new machine that's more energy efficient. That is reducing the energy intensity of this product. Or if they're putting solar panels on the roof, switching all their electricity out to solar panel lighting to produce this, and they've reduced their carbon intensity, the amount of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions that come from the production of this have decreased. That's an important concept. But unfortunately, as we just saw when we were talking about our previous concept, sometimes you get this rebound effect that goes along with that. So your book talks about relative efficiency being reduction of energy use per unit of output for producing this. But you have to think about this from an absolute perspective. In other words, just because it uses less energy to produce this item right here doesn't mean that that's better, because maybe I'm using it more frequently, or maybe the company is producing more of them, or maybe the savings that come because the product is cheaper means that I'm spending that elsewhere and still continuing to have a big impact. So let's look at one example of this, and let's look at this idea of, is car sharing actually green? So car sharing, you've probably seen these car sharing services where they have cars that you can rent out. They often will have them parked, and you'll go up to a kiosk. You have to have an account with them, linked to a credit card. You check out the car at the kiosk. It opens up. You can then use the car. You return it to another kiosk. They have these in a lot of big cities. It's a great idea. This idea, you live in a city, maybe you don't need to own a car, because those rare times when you do need one, you can use a car sharing service in order to check out the car and to use it. So there's a variety of different ways that that could impact the environment for good or for bad. So for one, users could decrease their amount of car travel because they get rid of a car and they don't need to drive as much. So the car sharing means that they've used, or maybe they could increase it because they still own a car, they're still driving a lot, or maybe they didn't used to own a car at all and they never used car travel. They only used public transportation. But now, because there's a car sharing service, instead of using public transportation, they're using a car sharing service. So that could be one option. The shared cars might have higher or lower fuel efficiency than the car that they had been using before that. Or car sharing could change the mix of transportation methods that people use, or affect the total number of cars that are on the road. So all of these have environmental impacts. What they found doing a research study on this, they found that indeed 58% of users of these car sharing services were previously carless and have now increased their car travel by about 620 miles a year. So counterproductive impact. There's this, that's the rebound effect here. That you used to have people who didn't have a car. They never used a car. Now, each of them are driving 620 miles a year because they had access to a car that they didn't. 58% of users, that's the case for. However, 17% of users used to have a vehicle, but shifted toward more sustainable transportation options and greatly reduced the amount of car travel they have. In other words, used to have a car, got rid of it. Now they only use public transportation or the occasional car service here. So they have greatly reduced their amount of miles driven. So taken together, they found a net 1,700 annual miles per user reduction. So altogether, yes, indeed, car sharing resulted in fewer miles being driven. Even though there are some, in fact, more than half, increased their mileage, those that reduced a whole lot. So that was significant. Plus, car sharing vehicles tended to have better gas mileage than regular vehicles. And the result was that for every shared car, about a half a car was taken off the road. So yes, it is green when looking at it, but you have to look at these. You have to look at all the different components of this to be able to understand whether or not these, because on the surface, you might think car sharing, yeah, of course that's green. Well, and in fact it is, but you need to look at all of the details related to that, because sometimes these things tend to not be quite as beneficial as you might think. This is an important concept, and we're going to talk about this at greater length later in the semester. But the short of it is that the answer to these consumption problems, we've had this, consumption is driving environmental impact, and this endless growth idea that our economy needs to grow endlessly is not at all sustainable in the long run. The solution to that, ultimately, something called dematerialization. Your book refers to it as decoupling. It's the same concept. It's the idea of decoupling economic growth from environmental impact, or dematerializing the way that we produce things. So the only way that we can continue to meet human needs without wrecking the planet is to separate those out. Find a way to grow economies without doing the environmental harm that we're doing today. Talk more about that a little bit later. Just some basic ideas behind that. The service economy, like car sharing services, is part of that. Doing more of reusing things, repairing things, repurposing things, like using this old ladder for a bookshelf, for example. Avoiding unnecessary items like trinkets or souvenirs or things that we don't really need. Focusing on experiences and consumables rather than material products, simplifying our lives. These are more on the individual style thing. We'll talk a lot more about how industry and corporations and governments can focus on this decoupling. It's a difficult thing to work toward, but that's where the solutions lie. Okay, briefly, in closing, I'm going to work through this quickly, but these are some individual tips, green consumption tips for how you can participate in consumption. We all consume, we all buy stuff. So what are some tips that we can think of? One, three main tips I want to focus on. Focusing on greener alternatives to things that you have to buy. So you got to buy food when you can afford it. Organic produce is better. It's a greener option. Or this is the stainless steel French press that I have. I got tired of my glass French presses breaking all the time and happened to buy a new one. So I got a stainless steel one, which has lasted for 6 or 7 years and hopefully will last for a whole lot more than that. So buying something that's really going to last a long time is really important to that. Or when you buy something, look for a sustainable certification on that. It's a greener option. So you got to buy lumber for a building project, fine. Try to find something that is sustainably certified. Or obviously, we all need clothes. So buy from, I think this is a picture I took from the Packed Clothing website. It's a company that focuses on sustainable clothing. You have to buy something that is produced sustainably. So greener alternatives to things that we need to buy. Green replacements for functional items. Now, this is one where you have to be careful. Keep disposal in mind. Think about what you're giving up. It's not always the right option to do, but reusable shopping bags, for example. talked about these need to be used 11 times in order to make up for the increased carbon footprint compared to a disposable bag. Well, buy them and use them 11 times, and they will be a better alternative. This is a freezer, stand-up freezer that I recently purchased. I got rid of an old freezer that was still functioning to buy this one. I debated for a long time whether it was worth it or not. In the end, I decided the old freezer, the thing wouldn't close properly. It was really energy inefficient. It used a ton of energy. This one is the most energy efficient model on the market. Ultimately, I decided that the energy efficiency from operating the freezer would more than make up for buying the new product. Plus, the old one I sold to someone who needed a freezer. So it's not like it went straight to disposal. It went to meet someone else's need. And if they were going to buy something new, then probably they weren't sustainably minded enough to buy the greenest one on the market. So let me buy the green one on the market, and they can buy the one that I was getting rid of. Or it's a Chevy Bolt. This is the kind of car I own. We got rid of our Prius to buy Chevy Bolt. Again, because when I looked at the math, when I looked at weighed the pros and cons environmentally, it made the most sense to sell my Prius to someone else and to buy an electric car, because my environmental impact was going to be much less from that. Now, of course, there's an environmental impact from making each vehicle, but that tends to be a lot less than the environmental impact of operating a vehicle. So that's what seemed to make the most sense. But keep disposal in mind. If you're replacing something with a greener option, make sure it actually is better. Think through that process, think through disposal, etc. Or new green products that you didn't previously have. Obviously something that's going to be inherently good for the environment, like planting trees or landscaping, it will be good. Or solar panels. This is a new product you didn't previously have before, but this is something that's going to have significant environmental benefit to it. Or maybe a rain barrel that you can collect water from, so you can reduce your water usage in your garden. Is that worth it? Maybe. I don't know. Certainly if you live in a place like Arizona or something where water conservation is critically important, something like this is definitely going to be the right environmental move. Is it the best move here in New York? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's hard to say. This is a product, I bought this actually and put it on all the circuits on my electrical panel. And what this does is it tells me in real time on my phone what each circuit in my home is doing electricity wise. Part of this is because I'm an energy geek, but what it's enabled me to do is to identify rooms in my house that are using more energy than I thought, and to make adjustments based upon that. To be able to look at, like, why is the dining room using so much energy right now? Like, oh, it's because we have this plugged into it, even though it's not turned on. Clearly it's using more energy than I thought it would. So this, yes, there's energy, there's environmental impact associated with producing this device right here, but it has helped me to identify other ways that I can save energy and reduce my environmental impact. So sort of a net positive from that. I'm going to skip through these last green consumption tips. There's a variety of different tips and benefits. Look for labels like these. These are good. Look for prominent placement on a website. Yeah, that's an interesting ad. All right, we're going to stop there. Sorry, I know this is a little bit longer. Thanks for hanging with me today.